Just a quick note, my pop filter wasn't working properly for the recording of this episode, so you might hear that as you listen. Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, the Buddha can appear to us in the realm of humans, but can simultaneously preside over his Pure Land, and can simultaneously live on through his Dharma teachings. How can this be? He is in three places at once.
Enlightenment affords powers that are perhaps not supernatural, but definitely supramundane. Plus, if there is no such duality as here and there, then it makes sense that the Buddha could be in multiple places at once.
Fascinating. Does he preach the same thing in all three places?
Indeed. The Buddha preaches the one Dharma according to the needs and sensibilities of each and every sentient being.
I wonder if, in the period of one single lifetime, we could meet all three bodies.
I believe this is likely quite possible with the right effort and concentration.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Trikāya doctrine, or the Three Bodies doctrine. What is the Three Bodies doctrine in Buddhism? What role does it play in ritual and doctrine? How have understandings of it changed over time? So let's begin. What is the Three Bodies doctrine in Buddhism?
This is a mainly Mahayana Buddhist doctrine which understands three dimensions or three aspects of the Buddha and what he teaches. These dimensions represent manifestations of the Buddha, and they all manifest in different ways at different times. This doctrine is an early Mahayana development, and the origins of it are varied and diverse, but it comes to later be systematized under the Yogacara school of Buddhism and other early schools in Mahayana Buddhism. That is to say that each of the three bodies was first referred to in different texts, rather than there being one sutra which fully explains all three of them, but later on they all connect to each other in the Yogacara school. All fully realized Buddhas are regarded as having all three bodies at the exact same time, but we're going to see how counting them gets complicated when we discuss how these bodies are related and connected. This doctrine is called Trikaya in Sanskrit, Sanshen in Chinese, and Sanshin or Sanjin in Japanese. And while that translates to three bodies, there are some specific points that make it more complicated than just saying that there are three different bodies of the Buddha and his teaching all at one time. So let's get into it. The first body is the physical and historical body of the Buddha. This body is called his Nirmanakaya, which roughly translates to the appearance body or the transformation body. These translations of that word relate to the fact that the Buddha appeared in our world and transformed upon reaching enlightenment and parinirvana. This body is the simplest to understand of all the three bodies. It's just Buddha the guy. It does not refer to his teaching or anything special like that. All Buddhas have one of these bodies, referring to the fact that, even if it was in the distant past, they were born in this world, and they lived their lives exactly the same way that the historical Shakyamuni Buddha did. They were born as princes, they saw the four sights, they renounced, and they became fully realized Buddhas in identical form to Shakyamuni. When the Buddha dies, his relics and remains are also thought of as being his Nirmanakaya, and are often venerated as such. Just like the Buddha when he was alive, these remains are thought of actually as having special powers to perform miracles, and these miracles often include healing people, multiplying themselves, protecting against evil spirits, and more. The next body is the Sambhogakaya. This body is the reward or celebration body. This is the manifestation of the Buddha that one will see whenever they go to a Pure Land or to a Buddha realm, which we've talked about before on this show. The most frequently cited example for this body is the version of Amitabha or Amida Buddha that one sees when they are reborn into Sukhavati, which is his Pure Land. Amitabha had a physical body in the distant past, and he also has a body which presides over his Pure Land and preaches the Dharma to its occupants. This is called the reward or celebration body because it's presented to practitioners as a reward for the meritorious practices that lead to rebirth in the Pure Land. All Buddhas have this body as well. If you remember, every fully realized Buddha has a Pure Land. This is the realm in which they did their work as bodhisattvas, purifying bad and creating good. Once their bodhisattva vows are fulfilled and their bodhisattva work is done, their Pure Land is created and they preside over this land in their Sambhogakaya. The third body is the Dharmakaya. This body reflects the Buddha's teaching and therefore also refers to the entirety of ultimate reality. Remember that Dharma has several uses as a word, and it can refer to law, or it can also refer to the order of things or ultimate truth, and so it's combined with the Buddha's teaching and reflects all of reality exactly as it is. In Latin, we say corpus when referring to a writer's body of work, and this can be a useful way to understand the Dharmakaya. It is the body of the Buddha's sermons and his teachings and the ideas and the materials that they refer to. This body is regarded as an actual body, much in the same way that the Buddha's physical remains are understood as his physical body. This body is most often associated with how we understand the nature of Vajranatha, the cosmic Buddha. Of course, he had a physical body as well, and a celebration body, but the way that esoteric Buddhists understand him now is that the entire phenomenal world is his very body. But the way that esoteric Buddhists understand him now is that the entire phenomenal world, as we see it, is his very body, his very Dharmakaya, preaching the Dharma to itself, by itself, for his own enjoyment. The nature of this body is often aligned with ultimate reality because that is one of the meanings of the word Dharma, like we said before. But different schools disagree upon which aspect of the Buddha's teaching is reflective of the ultimate reality of them. That is to say that some schools say that the ultimate reality of the Dharmakaya is the purity of Buddha nature. Others say that it is emptiness. Others say that it is interdependent origination. Others say it is Vajracana. This is thus one of the hardest bodies to pin down in terms of what it actually refers to and what it does. It's an open discussion whether the Dharma of the Buddha actually acts upon anything or not in the way that the other bodies act upon the world. The Dharma acts upon the world because those who uncover the truth of it through study and practice are enlightened and reach nirvana, but it's an open debate if it's a sentient body like the Buddha's physical body was. Can you pray to the Dharma and have it answer you? Esoteric Buddhists have a complicated answer to this question, which we'll mention next, and Mahayana Buddhists at large mostly say no, you can't pray to it and have it answer and do stuff for you. But they contradict themselves in some stories that we'll talk about in a moment.
What role does it play in ritual and doctrine?
In the Mahayana, for the most part, these bodies really just refer broadly to which version of the Buddha you're talking about in a given moment, and they serve to explain differences in their form, appearance, and interaction with the world. For example, if you remember from the Contemplation Sutra, which we read and discussed, when he is in his Pure Land, Amida's Sambhogakaya is extraordinarily tall and wide, his skin is purple gold, his hair is blue, his voice sounds like musical instruments, and more. But his Nirmanakaya, or his physical body, did not look like that. It looked human, or at least as much as the Buddha looked human whenever he had the 32 physical marks of a Chakravartin king. Similarly, Amida's Dharmakaya has no tangible form which we can touch. It's an object of cognition, which is one of the 6 Buddhist senses, but not one of our typical 5 senses that we refer to in the Western lexicon. Thus, we don't know what it looks like, even if it technically is his body in the form of his teachings. How can those 3 bodies be the same Buddha? Well, it's because he has 3 separate bodies and manifestations. Now, ritual is a complicated topic with regards to this doctrine, and the reason why is that these 3 bodies are thought of differently according to the understanding one has about the nature of the Dharmakaya. You'll remember that it's an open debate whether boiling down the ultimate truth of the Dharmakaya refers to Buddha nature, emptiness, dependent origination, and so on. However, note that the ritual aspects are all pointed at realizing that very nature of the Dharmakaya, whatever you think it is, and they change significantly depending on the practitioner or the monk's understanding of what that nature is. Let me explain. If one understands the Dharmakaya, ultimate reality itself, to be Buddha nature, then ritual and practice are pointed toward realizing that Buddha nature in this world. These practices vary among Chan, Zen, and Yogacara schools of Buddhism. We have an ongoing discussion about iterations of Buddha nature thought going on in our koan series of episodes and our regular episodes, and that is useful to remember here. Specifically, I've mentioned that there is a spectrum of Buddha nature. On the one end, there's the interpretation of it, which regards it as being the mathematical possibility of attaining Buddhahood in the distant future. That means that it's not understood as a tangible or a touchable thing. It is just one of the possible outcomes of causality, and thus our work is to harness causality and try to facilitate it as an outcome. The other end of the spectrum is that we are all originally enlightened, and thus our practice is not directed toward harnessing causality to facilitate the outcome of Buddhahood, but harnessing causality to re-uncover something that was already there. We already have it, and our practice is to do what Buddhas do to bring it about again. There is every other possible permutation of interpretation in between those two extremes, and it would take a while to go through them all, but understand that they exist. If one understands the nature of this Dharmakaya as being emptiness, then the ritual aspect is a completely different story. First off, it is typically earlier iterations of Chan, Zen, Yogacara, Madhyamaka, and other schools in history that regard this as being the nature of the Dharmakaya. It is not common anymore in the present day that Buddhists regard this as the ultimate nature of it. So if historically we believe that this nature is emptiness, how do we realize the ultimate nature of emptiness in this world through practice? The answer is that we kind of don't. We have to actually purify how we see the world around us instead, in order to make this happen. There are frequently no rituals to bring this about in the community sense. Instead, the ritual aspect is in individualized analysis of dharmas and in meditation. The idea is that we have to point all of our perceptions toward understanding and experiencing emptiness as the foundation of all fleeting phenomenal reality, and facilitate a means to having insight into the non-arising of all dharmas. This might be familiar in the Zen context because most practice involved jhana meditation. This involves, in our own modern terms, progressive stages of derealization and depersonalization pointed at this realization of emptiness that we've talked about. There is a major exception in the form of what is now called Soto Zen. Specifically, the innovations of Dogen, a 12th century Japanese Zen reformer who was all about original enlightenment, changed Zen engagement with the jhana meditation scheme significantly, because he emphasized just sitting, which is not the same as jhana meditation. If one regards the nature of the Dharmakaya as being aligned with Vairocana, then the ritual changes again. If you remember, the esoteric argument is that the entire world is a world text, which is the body of Vairocana and is revealing the Dharma all the time. Every sentient being and every individual thing that we can point to is a letter or a word in this world text, which his Dharmakaya is preaching to himself for his own delight. In this case, practice is pointed at understanding one's own nature as being coextensive with this text, and not just as an observer of its unfolding. And it's pointed at understanding exactly what is being preached. The way that this is accomplished is through practice of the three mysteries: mantra or sacred words, mudra or sacred body poses, and mandala or sacred geography. You'll remember that the whole point of these practices is to create a non-dual relationship and a karmic connection between the practitioner and the Buddha. We say mantra because that is what the Buddha says. We do mudra because those are the ways that the Buddha poses. And we create mandalas because those places are where the Buddha resides.
So this idea, in general, feels like it has a kind of similar shape to Western Christian ideas around the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost kind of thing, where the relationship between these three things is very important and has inclusions as well as exclusions that are considered really important by the people who are involved in the religion and the ritual. Would you say that's a fair comparison?
Very much so. In fact, whenever I was doing the background research on this topic to write this script, I actually found an enormous amount of comparative literature, which is essentially making the comparison that you just made. There's a lot of published literature out there which aims to help, for example, Christians understand the three-body doctrine in Buddhism, and Buddhists understand the Holy Trinity in Christianity. Because those three bodies and the Holy Trinity, they share some very important points, and they also kind of refer to the similar directions that both religions are pointing, which is that practicing and studying leads to some sort of experience with ultimate reality. In Christianity, the ultimate reality is God, and the experience with Him is going to heaven whenever you die. And in Buddhism, the experience of ultimate reality is enlightenment, and then subsequently nirvana. And doing what you have to do in both of these religions is necessarily going to make the practitioner encounter each of the three bodies along the way, each of the members of the Holy Trinity along the way. And they should be understood to be as one and not as three, even though we can kind of break them down into three dimensions or aspects.
So, how have understandings of the Trikāya changed over time?
You can kind of see the changes over time based on the different ritual aspects I mentioned in the last question. The earliest understandings of the nature of the Dharmakaya were probably the Madhyamaka and others I mentioned who believed it to be emptiness. Then, Buddha nature developed and divided opinions on the matter. Then, in the historically most recent stage of development, esoteric traditions developed their idea of the Trikāya. This has been, in my opinion, one of the most important streams of development in the Mahayana tradition. Like I mentioned in the last question, what somebody does in this sect versus that one depends almost entirely on how they understand the Trikāya of the Buddha and how they understand it to be realized in this world. Engagement from a commentarial and doctrinal standpoint with the nature of the Dharmakaya is a significant reason why there are so many Buddhist texts out there. This is where a lot of Western scholars point to in history when they say that Buddhism is a philosophical tradition, because it is here in this engagement with the Dharmakaya and the nature of it that you see what might be the closest analogous thing to Western philosophy in Buddhism. Like we said before, engaging with this Dharmakaya and writing about it is writing about the nature of ultimate reality, and what we should do as a result of whatever that ultimate reality is and what its nature is. That is, in essence, the fundamental aim of Western philosophy, and so it makes sense why this would be looked at in the colonial era as Buddhist philosophy. Now that we've covered all that, there's still an open question I mentioned almost at the very top of the episode. Is the Dharmakaya a separate body unto itself, or is it a linguistic means of referring to the teachings and nothing more? If we pray to the Dharmakaya, will it answer? This is where things get even more complicated than they've been thus far. First, I mentioned that esoteric Buddhists have a very complicated answer to this. They would say that yes, you can pray to it, but in essence, you're actually praying to the Sambhogakaya, because that is the one that actually does things for the sake of sentient beings' enlightenment, not the Dharmakaya. However, the prayer, if answered, is answered through some effect imposed on the Dharmakaya, because as you remember, everything around you and you yourself are all part of the Dharmakaya in this esoteric scheme. So changes that are made to you, changes that are made around you, are changes to the Dharmakaya. And that is how we understand the unfolding of the Dharma through everything in the phenomenal world. Not because of everything in its own nature, that's part of it, but also the way that it changes over time. What is impermanence if not this very change over time? Thus, whenever you pray to the Buddha and he answers, whether it's his Sambhogakaya or not that's answering, the change is a change in the way that the teaching is being revealed in the phenomenal world, which is complicated and must be done carefully and must be done particularly, but is still a participation in the unfolding of ultimate reality in what we might call our mundane reality. There are some Mahayana schools which regard the teaching itself as sometimes being able to do stuff also. Let's jump over to the Lotus Sutra and the Tendai and Nichiren schools for a moment. You'll remember from our discussions that the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra is hotly debated in history, but one popular interpretation is that the essential teaching is the immeasurable lifespan of the Buddha and universal Buddhahood. This teaching is referred to in short form by the word miao in Chinese or myo in Japanese. This word means wondrous, subtle, amazing, etc. Thus, the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, when it's referred to by Tendai or Nichiren scholars, is the subtle or wondrous teaching. Nichiren Buddhists believe, if you remember, that to say, praise be to the wondrous lotus teaching, or in Japanese, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, invokes that teaching and represents it and is a condensation of it and is equivalent to it. That's a quick way to refer to the teaching in conversation or in recitation where you don't have to actually read the entire 28-chapter Lotus Sutra. Well, there are these special stories out there in Japan about the Lotus Sutra which historically serve to legitimize it and serve to facilitate an oral history of the text, possibly to an illiterate public. People who participate in Lotus Sutra Buddhism in China and in Japan, but are not studying and analyzing the text like monks do, they need something that's going to elucidate the teaching and the power of it to them without getting them too mired in the philosophical and religious debates that are going on among the monastics. These stories which do this are called miracle tales, and some of them are really, really weird. In one of them, the Chinese letter miao or myo is actually a sentient character, and this character does stuff and freaks everybody out. In the story, which is called About a Government Official of Higo Province, a dedicated government official leaves the house for work, but he gets lost on his way in, and he eventually, after being lost for a very long time, finds a house. He wants to go investigate and see if there's somebody there that would help him, but the house looks totally empty and abandoned. Thinking that he could actually go inside because it was empty and he needed shelter, he goes in, but he actually discovers there's a beautiful woman there. Immediately, he's worried that she might be a demon or a cannibal, because it's very suspicious for a young, beautiful woman to live alone and in such a weird, abandoned-looking shack at this time period. The lady immediately transformed into the true form of being a demon and chased him. The demon got the government official's horse, but he actually was able to escape the demon and crawl into a deep hole while she was eating the horse. The government official thought that there was an even worse, more vicious demon in the hole who would eat him, and he wanted to escape as soon as he could, but he thought that he was trapped between that demon and the first one. However, while he's freaking out about what to do, he actually hears a voice say, "Don't be afraid, I'll save you." He looks around and he finds that this voice was coming from an animate letter, miao or myo, from the title of the Lotus Sutra, Myoho Renge Kyo. Apparently, a monk had previously erected a stupa of the Lotus Sutra to save people in these woods from demons and cannibals like the beautiful lady. And the character, the letter, Myo, went out and saved this guy. Afterward, this guy devoted his life to the Lotus Sutra and was eventually reborn in one of the Buddha realms, or one of the Pure Lands. This story is an example of a popular story among common and illiterate publics, This is an example of a popular story among a common and illiterate public in ancient times, which makes the teaching of the Lotus Sutra magical and mystical, and communicates its power to the audience, even if it is largely unknown to that same public what that teaching is. Myo just means subtle or amazing and wondrous. It doesn't tell the reader, the hearer of this oral tradition, anything about what the Lotus Sutra actually says. It's actually just saying, here's what happens if you erect a stupa to the Lotus Sutra. Here's what happens if you dedicate your life to the Lotus Sutra. This story is also an example of how some interpretations hold that the words themselves, which constitute the teaching of the Dharma, can go and do stuff to save people and help people. We'll read more of these miracle tales later on in the show because they're extremely fascinating and entertaining.
I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, which was a debate about the teaching itself being able to do stuff. Beyond this story of the letter Myo doing stuff, like, that's a cool story and I want to hear more of these stories now. But it also occurs to me that one of the things that these sutras do, this idea of the Dharmakaya being able to do things. In earlier episodes, we made a point a few times about how 3 of the steps to becoming enlightened, the Buddha making a prediction of your enlightenment, hearing the Buddha speak the Dharma, and giving an offering to a Buddha. It seems like the sutras, at least in Mahayana, accomplish the first 2 of those tasks in themselves. Like, that we've read at points where in a sutra it predicts the reader's enlightenment. So in that way, it feels like the Dharmakaya does that. Like, that is a thing it does.
You're absolutely right to think that. We have often encountered sutras which turn their attention directly at who is reading and who is reciting. And they say, if you read, if you recite, if you believe, if you accept, then everything that we have just talked about in this sutra applies to you. Your Buddhahood is predicted and is prophesized and is set in stone, and you're good, right? You have reached the stage of non-retrogression, right? It may take a long time for you, depending on how sinful you are, but you are ultimately on the right path, on the right stream, right? And I think that the meaning behind what you're referring to has to do with the fact that Mahayana Buddhism is, at its very core, most concerned with making the Dharma make sense in the absence of a living Buddha. Making the Dharma make sense now that Shakyamuni himself, Shakyamuni the guy, has died. That's a very important point, because we've talked about before in this show that at the time of the Buddha's death, there was a lot of terror that essentially nobody else would be able to ever help anybody reach enlightenment again, because nobody was as fully enlightened as the Buddha was. If we take it as capital T true that he preached everything that is called a sutra, that's a dubious thing to take for true, just understand that. But if we genuinely believe that he preached both the Lotus Sutra and the first sermon in his lifetime, then that's going to reflect that he's a very unique type of guy, right? I mean, he's more than any of these other people think that they could ever be. And so Mahayana doctrine not only develops as a means of keeping him alive and redirecting students from the person who is now dead to the teaching that he taught, but also affording the teaching a level of sacrality that I have not seen very much in other religious traditions, right? Obviously, it's disrespectful to abuse holy texts of other religions, but the actual words themselves of the Lotus Sutra, the letters which make up those words and the sentences of the Lotus Sutra, are each individually worshipped as Buddhas themselves. That is intense. We don't do that with the Bible. Every single letter of the Bible is not God or Jesus or anything like that. It's holy words, it's divine words, but each letter of the Lotus Sutra has a shrine, and there's 28 chapters of it, right? That's no small thing. So I think that is what you're referring to. Everything has been pointed away from the historical guy and now to how to make sense of what he taught in a post-Shakyamuni world.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of the Trikaya doctrine in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss the Buddha's own son, Rahula. Who is Rahula? What role does he play in the texts? How does his role change over time? We hope to see you there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.